David Matthews from Spark of Life. Our heartbeat is to walk beside those who are grieving and those who have experienced devastating loss. The other day, my good friend Lyle lost his wife. It was back in March of 2020. He lives right down below me in a condo unit, and he had been married for over 50 years. And this COVID-19 thing that is happening all over the world, she was in a nursing home. His wife, Linda, he could not go see her. And so for about the last month of her life, he was not able to hold her hand every day the way he wanted to as she passed from this life to the other life. That obviously devastated him and his family, his children. They wanted to be there in their mother's last few days. They weren't able to do that. He was grieving deeply because of the loss of his love of his life and also his companion and his co-worker that had worked beside him all these years, and also because he couldn't go see her. Loss piled upon loss. The other day I sat down with him in his patio and we were drinking coffee together. He said, "David, you're the grief guy." I never wanted to be the grief guy, by the way. Never wanted that at all, but you know, life takes real different turns than you expect. And so my wife and I for the last 10 to 12 years have done almost nothing but deal with those in crisis and those in grief and in all kinds of grief. And we've done 105 retreats at beautiful locations for those who are grieving. We have an online course in grief. We're about to do virtual grief retreats, online, of course. And so I guess I am the grief guy, or one of the grief guys. And Lyle said, "You're the grief guy." This morning I sobbed and I sobbed and I sobbed, and I know where Linda is. You see, Lyle's a believer in Christ. He believes in the afterlife. He believes Linda's in a better place. He believes that her suffering is over because she suffered greatly. He said, "David, I know these things. I believe these things, that Linda is where she needs to be. Why did I cry this morning for like an hour and I couldn't stop?" Basically saying, what's wrong with me? That's probably the question we hear the most of those who are grieving deeply. What is wrong with me? And the answer I gave Lyle is what we give to almost every person that comes to a Spark of Life gathering, a workshop, a retreat, or online coaching, or whatever. It's the answer I always give. There's nothing wrong with you. You're grieving. Grievers need to grieve. And he said, "That's your advice?" I said, "Yeah, I wish it was more profound, but the price you pay for love is grief. You must grieve. Don't try to stop grieving. And so when grief comes over you, give yourself permission to grieve." And so our grief essential that we talk about often at Spark, that essential number one, so I can set myself up for a healthy recovery, is give myself permission to grieve, and to grieve deeply where I am, when I need to. When I cry, I need to feel like crying. I just need to cry. Definition of grief is, I think most of us understand somewhat about what grief is. Grief is the natural and normal response to loss of any kind. Not just death loss. It could be the losses we've experienced with COVID-19. It could be a loss of not being able to go see your loved one in the hospital, or your child having surgery, and you can't sit there and hold his hand. That they won't lay you in the hospital. It could be the loss of a job, a loss of a career, a loss of dream. It could be divorce. It could be lots of things. Lyle had lost his wife. He needed to grieve. Viktor Frankl is one of my favorite characters. He wrote this book, Man's Search for Meaning, and Frankl is in this German concentration camp. He lost everything. He ended up losing his wife. He lost his possessions. He lost everything, but he didn't lose his will. And Man's Search for Meaning is a great book. Viktor Frankl said, an abnormal reaction to in an abnormal situation is a normal response. Think about it. Life changes suddenly when you lose the dearest on earth to you, or whatever loss you're experiencing. And it's not normal. I've had this person and now they're gone. Lyle was married for over 50 years to Linda, and now she's gone. How could he respond in a way that he always responds? No, grief is the normal response in a very abnormal situation. Grief hurts. Grief stinks. Dr. Earl Groman, a Jewish rabbi, was called upon in the Oklahoma City bombing aftermath and so many hundreds died. And it was 1995, and he was called in, and he's written a lot about grief. He said, grief is not a disease. It is not something that needs to be fixed. Groman said, grief is the price you pay for love. The only cure for grief, he wrote, is to grieve. You gotta grieve. Grief stinks. And some other videos that are coming, we're going to talk about that we not only give ourselves permission to grieve, but also permission to recover. We're going to be talking about what that means and how does that look and what can you really do practically. Practical steps to help you grieve in a healthy way, to help you live forward with hope, with confidence, and yes, with renewed joy again. How is that possible? But I've got to start by giving myself permission to grieve. And it's not a one-time thing, as you know. And so permission to grieve is powerful. Dr. Norman Wright, H. Norman Wright, has written many things about grief. I've read some of his books on grief. I went to a conference, he had a lecture he had about grief. I'll never forget, and he's very popular. He's very old too, but I'm getting up there close to him. But Dr. Norman Wright, his big message is normalize grief. At our Spark work, when we work with grievers, we all often say that you don't need to be fixed. And the reason grievers don't need to be fixed is because there's nothing wrong with them. They have broken hearts. They don't have a broken brain. You might not have a broken faith, even though you might think as if you do. We're going to have another video series about faith in grief. And is deep grief evidence of a weak faith? And by the way, the quick answer is no, it's not. It's not evidence of a weak faith. You might feel weak. But see, you don't need to be fixed if you're in grief. You need to grieve. And that grief is not a one-time thing. It keeps coming, and it keeps coming, and it keeps coming. We had a person at one of our retreats tell us an illustration about the ocean and the waves coming in. You might have seen it on Facebook posts. There's been a lot written about the waves of grief coming in, and some waves are very, very small, and some waves are like tidal waves. They're just so gigantic. They suffocate you, and they throw you to the bottom of the ocean, and it's like you can't even breathe for a while. And so when big waves come, that metaphor of the wave in grief is so powerful, because when the wave comes, and if you go to a real ocean with really big waves, and I've been there in the Pacific Ocean and in Hawaii. We stayed this last year at a place somebody gave us to stay, and man, some of those waves were huge. And you know, if you go out in the ocean and this huge wave comes at you, and then you're going to brace yourself against that wave, and you're going to face it, and you're going to say, I'm not going to let the wave get to me. That wave could hurt you badly. And the best way to deal with huge waves is to let the wave carry you where the wave wants to carry you. Don't fight against it, and pretty soon you're on shore. You're wet, and you might have really hurt, and it might be really bad, but you're on safe shore. Give yourself permission to grieve, to let the waves of grief carry you. And an odd thing happens when you do that. You realize there's nothing, quote, wrong with you. That grief means you love deeply. You lost something or someone that you loved, and it hurts. At Spark of Life, we want you to know there's always hope for grief and for those feelings of despair and hopelessness. There's always hope at Spark of Life, we teach, because you see, we are human beings who have a great capacity to deal with awful things. Give yourself permission to grieve, and then you'll be in a better position to get up and live forward with hope. In our next few videos, we're going to talk about what that looks like. Like our channel. If you subscribe to our channel, like this video, go to sparkoflife.org, sparkoflife.org for more grief help.